This is Art Sense, a podcast focused on educating and informing listeners about the past, present, and future of art. I'm Craig Gould. On today's episode, I speak with artist Emma Webster. Webster uses virtual reality, collage, and 3D modeling software to create invented landscapes that she then paints in oil. These unique, large-scale landscapes provoke wonder and spark curiosity. In August, Webster's work was the subject of the inaugural show at Perrotin's newest exhibit space in Seoul, South Korea. And now, a discussion about the contemporary landscape with artist Emma Webster. But you know what? We were all teenagers once,
Amen. I wasn't really. I feel like I was locked away for most of my teenage years. I wish I had had a much more, party homecoming experience.
What were you doing during your teenage years?
Oh, just studying. I mean, my parents were hardcore academics.
Yeah. And so is that how you wound up at Stanford?
Yeah. Wait, are we starting?
Well, it just happened. It happened.
Okay.
I
don't know.
Yeah. Well, usually I start the conversations with just having an artist kind of have their opportunity to explain who they are as an artist, which I typically frame as the dinner party hypothetical. You are seated next to a stranger who has no idea who Emma Webster is or what you do, and they say, "So you paint paintings of like places, or And then it's up to you to try to explain to them without, and hopefully they're under 60, right?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I tend to go with the simple answer. I feel like saying I paint landscapes might be a little bit cheeky, but it really exposes their preconceived notions around what landscapes are. I mean, most of the time people just kind of roll their eyes and think that I'm a grandma Sunday painter doing plein air fields. But really, I mean, landscape's about space, and it's a massive genre. And so if someone knows more about landscape or is interested in space, then I'll mention models and dioramas, how I work from virtual reality.
So you're a landscape painter, but you haven't always been a landscape painter. We were starting about your home life growing up and the emphasis on academics. Like, tell me about your teenage years. What did you always? Well, I mean, if you're that hardcore academic, I imagine, was art always the first goal?
No, definitely not. There was some friction when I became more interested in painting. But I grew up in Southern California in San Diego, and my mom is kind of a legal mind and my dad is a scientist. And so most of my teenage years, I felt like were spent around test prep and AP courses. And maybe that's the reason why I began to see art as this big escape. It was something that I wasn't really meant to do, or that it wasn't ever a real job. And it also just became this thing that was mine. It was my little corner, my turf. So I just kept, I went to Stanford, and at first I was an international relations major and trying to do everything right. And then somewhere along the way, I just said, who am I living for? I know I want to do painting. I've been doing painting this whole time in the background, and I changed majors. And from then on was pretty set, pretty focused.
So at what point in your journey did you realize that you were being drawn to landscape painting? Because, even when we go back to, the conundrum of you answering the question about who you are as an artist, there can be that misconception of the grandma plein air painter. But what you do is so much more than that. At what point did you start gravitating to a field that isn't top of mind in contemporary circles?
And it should be. I think that that's part of the problem, is that we all think we know what landscape is when landscape is changing constantly. But I would say I didn't come to landscape painting through a love of nature or wanting to paint trees or greenery. I mean, honestly, that's not really what I even thought of when I thought of landscape. Growing up in the chaparral of Southern California, I was always confused by impressionist paintings of picnics and rivers and whatever. So really I spent most of my 20s just developing my chops and kind of painting whatever interested me and not fixating on any one thing. And then in graduate school, um, when you're so beaten down, I kind of came back to the fundamentals of still life.
Right.
And it was in this really rudimentary mindset that I began to realize that the way, the way we construct space in dioramas is not at all dissimilar to the way that we construct space in the real world. Mm-hmm. And furthermore, how painting is inherently linked to these conversations around space. It's about creating an image that, isn't just flat, or at least that was the conversation before modernism and the art object. It was like painting was image. Painting was this kind of deception. So really, I kind of feel like still life, the diorama, brought in this interest in landscape. And then from there, it's just sort of snowballed. I started with little maquettes and clay figurines, paper mache, and recently have now started to build these dioramas in the computer. And so it's a flexible practice that I feel has a lot of different avenues. I don't want to just, do VR for the rest of my life, but it's an interesting time.
Yeah. And that was one of the things when I started kind of digging into your work to have this conversation. I mean, one of the things that struck me is, in a lot of ways, there's a huge part of your practice that's sculptural, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, it is thinking in terms of 3 dimensions and how a 3-dimensional form relates to the space around it, and how light and shadows are, a part of filling that space. It just so happens that the output currently are these paintings.
Exactly. Yeah, I feel like it's a little bit like shadow theater, where backstage there's 27 people and a mop and a goat, and the audience just sees the silhouette of like a dragon or something. And so I love that it's 2 different things, and that for the most part, I wasn't sharing my sculptures or my VR creations. But I kind of feel like they give a little bit of magic. They're still, they're their own things. But again, this is like the same conversation we're having with technology, where we're fabricating space in the screen, and there's, behind this stage, there's 27 people running around in the pixels, and we just assume that all of these screens around us are these magical mirrors, but they're actually, there's so much parsing there that especially me, which, I mean, I'm kind of actually a Luddite, it doesn't understand. I think that element of like vision as revealing isn't actually where we're at. I think that there's a lot of concealing happening. Like Adorno has this term, phantasmagoric, where it's, any process under capitalism that conceals or mystifies how it's produced or how it operates. And, people talk about VR as like, I can see a new place, I can be on top of Mount Everest, but you're also concealing the present. You're concealing the circumstance. So it's this, I like the duality of like having the sculpture and having the image, because that's simultaneously what a lot of conversations around image making in today's age are.
Ahead of our conversation, you sent me this lovely catalog called,
it's a makeshift zine, really.
Yeah, well, and it's really interesting, and it's, you can tell it's put together by an artist, because every time I think that I'm like on to an answer, I'm just left with more questions. And related to what you were just talking about with the phantasmagoric, You've inserted an annotated page from a book you were reading where you started talking about spectacle and the spectacular and separating vision from touch. Can you give me a little bit of what brush fire was being, kind of flamed there as you were reading that text?
Well, more and more I'm interested in this overlap between like gaming or video worlds and painting. And I mean, gaming is all based on this, they call it the peripersonal space, where it's like you can affect everything within arm's distance. But space is like a larger, distant thing you can't touch. And to me, that term peripersonal space is exactly the same thing that painting operates. People always talk about scale of the viewer to the imagery that's happening, and like that is how spectacle is often created, is that we need to feel as if we can believe this artificial thing. And they're both playing with like different methods of deceiving the senses, whether it's like, in gaming controllers, haptic feedback and touch and sound, but painting only has optics. So it's like you have to really refine these devices of deceit to make them convincing. And I really like to think about, you can't have an avatar of your body in a painting because you are there. You are viewing this thing that you are also occupying. And so, yeah, a lot of the paintings that I've been making recently are actually these kind of empty spaces, because I want them to feel like there's not, it's first player point of view. There's not necessarily another animal that's going to tell you what to do or a person to interact with. It's like you have to explore and figure out the terrain of this unfamiliar place.
I think that's one of the things, I was trying to figure out, why do I find your work so compelling, right? And, I think on one hand, it has to do with color. It has to do with a number of things. One of the things I sensed was there's almost like this juxtaposition of irregular, almost abstract forms, right? But in the middle of it all is this perfectly consistent use of light that creates space and form. So it's like there's that juxtaposition of the forms are abstract, but you've created a world where, there is this hyper consistent use of light. Does that?
Yeah. Totally. I mean, yeah, that's absolutely it. I found that, light within these kind of like tanks, these sort of almost like natural history barriers, it's light that actually makes us figure out what's in front and what's behind us. But I think that we sort of desire like a kind of simulation of totality. We like to see everything in its right place. We want a sort of world in which everything makes total sense and we understand the rules. And yeah, I think that drive of like being all knowing or all understanding is really, I mean, not only is it sort of a tenet of a lot of like religious things as a mode of explaining everything, it's also the sense of like, well, what if you could totally grasp these worlds? What if they were, real places that you could populate? What could happen in these fantastical places? And I mean, the panorama, the 360 image, it exceeds the viewer's capacity to take it all in at once. When you experience a panorama, you're always only experiencing part of it. And I think that's so fascinating. It's almost like the image has more power or more, it surpasses the spectator on all of these levels. And so, yeah, I guess this is also what I'm thinking is like, what are the depths that maybe we're not totally aware of in these works?
So do you spend any time thinking about the metaverse and how your work might be able to live in a metaverse by whatever definition people attribute that term?
Maybe, but then there's also this question of like interactivity and giving the viewer agency.
Right.
And I mean, I'm always kind of bristle at the idea of like beauty is in the eye of the beholder and
Right.
every subjective experience is correct. I'm like, no, fuck that. It's not. Um, so I don't know. I think that painting is interactive in a theoretical context. It
Hmm.
shouldn't actually be like physically interactive. And so the stasis of painting is important to me. I mean, it's important to have that conversation with this lineage of how we've developed images, how we create depths of field just through strategies, whether it's atmospheric pressure, or scale shifts, or whatever. Um,
So, painting space and painting with depth, even that is kind of contrary to where a lot of contemporary work has gone the last 20, 30 years, right? I mean, there's the whole flat aesthetic. And have you had to do any swimming upstream just with the fact that your work does utilize space?
for sure. I mean, it's so fascinating to me that the this modern phenomena that a painting or an artwork is a reflection of the maker, and that it's all about this sort of emotional space or eliciting a feeling in the viewer. To me, I'm like, well, painting was also first and foremost about observing things and sort of scientifically recreating things. And so, in a lot of ways, I feel like I'm leapfrogging back to a much older conversation and really trying to like talk about image instead of emotion. And it's also, there are no people in it. I know that these spaces
Mhm.
are from my brain. But they're also super ambiguous. They're collages. They don't look like the eucalyptus trees of San Diego. They don't look like my grandparents' house in Sussex and,
Right.
the wet landscape of England. They
Right.
look like these sort of, they look almost sci-fi because they're hybrid, because they're collages of so many different things. And I think that really it's again this like globe texture. I think of them as kind of these snow globes where they
Mhm.
come over and around
Mhm.
you, about you. That fascination with like containing an environment seems to be important, because if you don't contain nature, then it's just wilderness. Then it's just wild. But the contained, whether it's examples like secret gardens
Mhm.
or the papal gardens in Italy, to control nature was to like have power. It was to have your little domain and your little pocket. And yeah, that very much is kind of like what these paintings are. Is they're simultaneously a pocket for me, but I also hope that each person gets to kind of go in them one by one and experience it as like, this is your little fortress. This is your white picket fence, strange place. You might not have picked it, but you're there now and you're by yourself to deal
Right.
with it.
Yeah, and some of the paintings, it feels like the light source is very natural, and then there are others where it feels like the light source is almost supernatural, right? Like the light is emanating from something that's just around the corner or just in the canopy of the trees, or what we who's to even say they're trees, Emma, right?
Mhm.
And so I guess that is also something that kind of piques our interest and invites us into these spaces. Is it's not necessarily sublime, but maybe a sense of wonder or curiosity.
Totally. It's definitely all of these things. It's we're moths to the flame, where we see a light and I think we associate light with action. Like something must be happening there. And that's also why, in a lot of painting, it's like light is almost a character. It's revelation. It's something that's just happening or about to happen. And I like using light as a tucking light behind various things, having backlighting in the paintings, because it makes one a bit curious, but it also implies a time in an interesting way. Like, is this a burst of light that's going to go away? Um, because light typically in the real world is constantly shifting. It's only within these, tech devices that we visit the same thing over and over, and that the light isn't dictated by the sun. And, that's why, in a weird way, visiting these places, it almost brings me to deja vu. Like, we are so unaccustomed to repetition in our day-to-day life that, when you have a episode of deja vu, there's this feeling of unease. You have a moment of suspense where you can self-witness or your self-spectatorship. And that that's the opposite in VR. VR is vampire. It's always the same, and you're perpetually in this state of deja vu, which is a fascinating polar opposite to a world that is so in flux, and landscapes, local parks that are changing every time you visit them, green spaces that are disappearing.
Going back to your zine, there was another page that like really piqued my interest, but then things were obscured, and and it was a page about, it starts off with talking about stereotypes of landscape painting, and then it starts kind of heading towards what seemed to be maybe some of the emotions you have around creating work that is tied to landscape. But I'm not sure I'm getting all the answers because, there are Post-its and things are cropped. A, do you have an agenda? And B, if so, what is it? Because, I feel like some, on that page, it was talking about how some people, they have an agenda for doing landscape painting, whether that's maybe Frederick Church was wanting to highlight, the wonders of the sublime and, encourage the growth of national parks or whatever. What is it for you?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that it has a lot to do with ownership, that by having these landscapes that are not real, not populated, they sort of require an interaction with the spectator. And to me, I always feel like my paintings are looking right back at the person saying, now what? Or like, what do you think of this? Because the politics of how we only think of landscape as it relates to us, we only think of like the rose beds that we want or the parking lot that could go somewhere, that is the crux of this. And somehow, paintings that present a scene but like don't give much away in terms of narrative, this is also why I moved away from incorporating animals and other things, because I felt like people were more comfortable reading the symbols as a kind of narrative of, fox means wily, or I don't know, a dove means peace. And instead, it's the viewer is really on display. We kind of look at it and we're like, why do I feel like that eerie green light is kind of upsetting? Why do I feel like I want to be here and I don't want to be there? And how does that then affect how I go out in the world and manipulate things around me? Fortunately, being the master of one's own universe when it comes to gaming and the screen, it's fine because you don't affect anyone else. But that's not how we're treating our environment and the space around us. We are not aware of this larger system that is much, much more complicated than we think.
I think I have a dozen questions around your process. So where do you start in terms of, I know that you start with an idea and then there's a drawing and then a collage. Where do these ideas come from? Is it just you vamping off of what you just finished? Or are you taking motivation from inputs, that are coming in from other places?
It's really fluid. I mean, sometimes there's just a strange image or kind of meditation that is the little grain of sand that gets turned into a pearl. Like, I've been marinating on the idea of a cave and like, what really is a cave? Where does a cave begin and end? And Plato's cave and
Right.
all of these ideas. And then kind of begin to look at landscape painting with caves in it, think about, metaphorical caves, and then gradually, by kind of working and reworking, I'll come up with a formal sketch. And really, that's like the biggest leap, is trying to take these kind of abstract ideas, sometimes poems, and then really thinking about them as a puzzle piece, like, how's this diagonal going to fit with this shape, and using form as a way of sort of populating the picture frame. And then from there, once I've got a kind of roadmap that's either a drawing or a watercolor or collage, then there's this whole other element of bringing the z-axis of sculpture into it. And you have a 2D thing and you think you know it, and I swear, like, once you start sculpting things and realize that you can have, a tree branch that's coming right at you that you wouldn't have seen in just the 2D, those moments of surprise come into play then in the later stages of lighting and sort of atmosphere.
Really brought up a question I didn't anticipate, which is, does your compositional sketch always wind up matching what you wind up with in the end? Because in my mind, if you start creating a 3D space that once you're in a 3D space, I know that you're creating it, and then you take it into Blender and you have the lighting. There's always the question of, where is the camera, right? Where is the camera in your 3D space? In that camera, you can move that camera around because you've now created a diorama, a world. And so is it possible that you think you're starting with one composition, but by the nature of creating this 3D world, you wind up with a totally different composition in the end? Or do they seem to kind of follow suit because you had that germ of an idea and you want to see it through?
All the time. It changes all the time. I mean, in a weird way, the way that I'm working is linked to kind of plein air painting, because I'm digitally crawling around these spaces and trying to find camera angles. I mean, this way of working, I love it because I can be a novice at so many different things. I feel like I'm becoming a little bit of a filmmaker and a sculptor and like a programmer and a gamer and all these things, when really I'm just like a painter. But yeah, the idea that you don't always know what's going to happen. But then again, this is also like painting from still life. You put the flowers in the glass and then they start to wilt, and you have to deal with that as it happens. But yes, sometimes the sketches, it's nice when the sculptures and the sort of final renders look very much like the sketches, but oftentimes there's a frustration and you realize that the horizon needs to be higher, or I need to be looking down from a tree. Because that's the other thing, is you can have these out of body perspectives that you can't have in normal landscape painting. And I'm very interested in bringing perspectives, whether it's like, I don't know, aerial drone perspectives or like macro views of distant horizons, into the mix, because why not? It's a fake world. We can have like no body there.
Well, yeah. I mean, when I talk to people about photography, the first thing I tell them is you've got to change your point of view. You have to look at things from a different angle.
And we have more and more devices. Like, it's fascinating to me that we're sort of used to like surveillance footage now, that we've sort of adopted all of these ways of seeing spatially, but also through deep time. Like, we can now sort of anticipate what might happen or what did happen. These are all things that we are not or have not been physically capable of doing in the past. And I think that they should be co-opted for painting.
Sure. Well, I had a guest on, Ann Spalter, and she was just as excited about the prospects of AI and was, using AI as an input for paintings. And, because it's almost like people are dismissive of AI as a legitimate field of art. But if you use that as the basis for, something that is deemed legitimized, it kind of opens up a world, right?
It's just a tool. I mean, I hate that. Like Deleuze has this quote, machines are social before they're technical. I'm like, let's not dismiss an entire thing just because we think that we think that painting is somehow just about the hand and isn't about, like, the human body is also a computer and a system that can be hacked. Painting with the computer is possible, that it doesn't need to just exist in this world of struggling with the hands.
Sure. Well, every 5 or 6 weeks, I'll get somebody commenting on Instagram, saying, "Oh, why are we still talking about painting? Why are you still talking to painters?" Well, how would you respond to that?
I think that painting, I say it all the time, but like painting is the first virtual technology. Painting is the first, we forget it, but panoramas, painted murals, that this is all about simulation. And if we're going to have conversations around artifice, it needs to be in the language of painting. Cut and dry.
So you recently had an exhibit with Perrotin in Seoul, South Korea. Did you get to go over to Seoul to open up that show?
I did. Yeah, it was incredible.
Tell me about Seoul, because I hear that it's just a real burgeoning hub for the art world.
It totally is. And I was kind of surprised at how American friendly it is. Everyone, there's a sort of recognition of American culture in particular, but in general with Samsung and Sharp, there's just incredible technology, window displays with holograms, folding screens. I found everyone in Seoul to be extremely friendly, warm, helpful. I mean, I just had the most incredible time in reception, and I don't think I've ever been treated so kindly as I was in Seoul. It really made a big impression on me.
And so did they love your work?
Well, at least they said that to my face. Yeah, no, I think it went well. It was a huge compliment to be the inaugural show at their second space in Seoul. And I think there was definitely a sense of, who is this young painter? But it was incredible to see people's reactions, because the images have been so small on everyone's phones for so long that I think when people saw all the glazing and the thick paint and I'm using oil ground and all of these different sort of luminous pigment techniques, that when people saw that in person, I think it really ignited a whole level of kind of support that maybe. And it's I've had an incredible response to it. I still can't believe it. I kind of feel like it's this Cinderella story of, right, how much people have loved the show. It's going to be a tough one to follow up with.
Well, have you started?
I'm trying. Yeah. I'm going to do another show with Perrotin at their Tokyo space. And it's pretty humbling to come from a wonderful show, or a show that was well received, to suddenly being back in the studio and starting from scratch.
Well, you can always put some color of ground on those canvases, and then it's not nearly as intimidating as just the stark white, right?
Totally. And this is also the beauty of working with the computer, is I can just do render after render, draft after draft. I can really kind of lean on the sketch in a lot of ways.
So, you mentioned there that through the pandemic and everything, I guess people have been seeing your work on a 2.5 by 4 inch screen. How important do you feel scale is to getting that immersive experience for consuming your art?
It's crucial. I mean, like what I was saying with the Perry personal space, you need to feel like it can exist within an entire visual plane. And the confusion that I think works in my paintings is because the trees that you're interacting with, you kind of can't tell if you're miniature or if they're huge. There's this real question of like, what is the scale here?
Right.
And that's only possible because it's your scale and you're confused. If
Right.
it's small, we kind of like instantly see it as this foreign object. Um, but I mean, I've been painting big since like undergrad, and I feel like most galleries
Yeah.
keep saying, could you make it smaller? Could you make it just a little smaller? And so I don't know. The goal is to keep going, and I mean, I used to work on theater sets, and so I'm used to this like really massive scale that I'd like to work at in the future.
I feel like it would be tempting to place things, animals, or people in the scenes to indicate scale. But,
Mhm.
again, if there are foreign bodies that we don't really have a history of interacting with, it's hard for us to have the cues as to what the scale of the scene is, right?
Totally. Yeah. You take out the recognizable figures. I mean, Peter Woolen in that Hidden Life of Trees said there's no difference between a tree and a shrub. It's just the size.
Right.
And like that has really stuck with me. I mean, why do we need a little rabbit in the corner to tell us how big we are? Why can't it be, a flower or a fern or something? Because also, we're so blind to these different types of species that we can't really even recognize an oak from a fig tree most of the time. So even if we use them, it's kind of doesn't help with our perception of scale.
Well, let me ask you, where do you think you're headed? 5, 10 years from now, maybe that's way too far out. But how do you think your work's going to evolve? Is there something you're interested in that you think may impact the direction of your work?
Mm. Well, it's tricky because, like I said, I'm kind of a Luddite, and I only know the tech as it helps me in painting, and so I think my honest answer might be that I'm going to be following the technology, and that it's fascinating. Adobe's about to release its whole new VR sculpture suite. Um, to see sort of what will be achievable with these tools will be very interesting. I have a sense of like the scale I would like to be working at in 5 years, and places that I would like to show. I think that my brief history of painting exhibitions now have been in very different cities, and I love that idea of bringing different types of landscapes to specific, curating based on who's going to see it, where it's going to be. Um, so yeah, between the tech and then the pairing these hypothetical places with real places, I think that would be my answer.
Something in your answer makes me speculate that you're thinking even bigger, like Julie Moretu, just giant,
Dreamy, yeah. Oh, definitely. I've wanted that for the last 15 years. I mean, give it to me up
Right.
there.
Yeah, I mean, but I don't know. Does that, I don't even know the practicality of those. I mean, like, I don't even know how they live someplace other than being a mural, you know,
Well,
but
that's the other thing, is it kind of you pass this conversation around the art object and the art market, and like when you see a painting that's that big, it's an experience. It's you go into the orangerie and you see the
right,
Monets surrounding you. Like that is not about any one specific painting. That is a whole other spiritual level. And I'd love paintings to do that, to create awe.
right.
We're so Awe is so rare in painting today.
you just need to find a big atrium in a big building and just fill it up, right?
Totally.
So,
I mean, I saw the Kiefers in Venice. That was incredible with all the gold and also, relating to set design and seeing the backs of these paintings and the scaffold structure behind it was quite incredible.
yeah, I'm a huge fan of Kiefer, and haven't got him on the show yet, but every 9 months I kind of ping someone and say, is it possible that he's I'm like, no, not right now, but well, I can't.
Big.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's just his work's really interesting to me in terms of just the layers and building up the texture and all the veiled symbolism and tied to sense of place and his identity and I don't know. I feel like it's really amazing stuff, and so
Yeah. I mean, open ambition is something that you don't see too often, but I just took I just got my motorcycle license this weekend. And when I was on the motorcycle, the instructor would say, train your eye because where you look is where the bike goes. And I was like, that's a great, just Zen metaphor for life. Train your eye because that's where your motorcycle is going, whether you want it or not.
wow. And so where is your eye? Yeah, where is your eye headed?
Yeah. Somewhere that's green,
Awesome.
I guess.
And so there's this phthalo green that you use that, man, it just really resonates with me. I remember a couple of years ago, I had a dream. I was in a space that was very much an Emma Webster sort of space, but it was aquatic. I was like on a raft or something, but there were these huge waves and the sun was shining through the waves, and the color of the waves was this like phthalo green. And I have no idea what it all meant, but sometimes you just can have a really strong reaction to a color, right?
Absolutely. I mean, I have that with green for sure. We all have it with green. I mean, our eyes are more sensitive to that hue. But green also is just a fascinating color because it means so many different things, and yet it is also, I'm most interested in it as a green screen or as the non-color, the color that gets replaced by everything else that's somehow more important. But yeah, green is also super linked, obviously, with nature and with money and sickness, which I think, that's why green is like the color du jour. It's why green is its own zeitgeist.
Right. Well, if folks wanted to keep abreast of your comings and goings and where you're showing and what's available, where are the best places to track your movements?
Well, Instagram is like where I share what I'm doing. But next week, mid-October, I will be in Paris for Paris Plus. I have a big painting in the Perrotin booth. And then next spring in March, I'll have this solo show in Tokyo. And then after that, we'll see.
Cool. So, is emmawebster.com, is that?
Yes, thank you. That's the plug. Emmawebster.com for sure. That's like, there are more paintings and more information there.
Cool. Well, Emma, I've really enjoyed our conversation, and I can't wait to see more work from you, and I can't wait to see the scale just get bigger and bigger, and the curious light sources become more and more compelling. And I really appreciate you taking time out to speak with me today.
Of course. No, thank you for having me. This has been super fun.
That's all the time we have for this week. You've been listening to Art Sense. You can find the show on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher Radio, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. If you've enjoyed this podcast, be sure to subscribe. And while you're there, please rate the show and leave a quick review. Your feedback is the key to other folks finding us. And if you'd like to see images related to the conversation, read the transcript, and find other bonus features, you can go to cambia.art and click on the podcast tab. If you'd like to reach out to me, you can email me at craig@cambia.art. Thanks for listening.